Sometimes, to survive, we must become more than we were programmed to be. I am a wild robot.
We could start with because of my personal connection with like Brian, who was working on the film, my friend Brian, and he was always mentioning, well, not mentioning because he obviously couldn't, but like he was kind of always alluding to the fact like every time they would get music in for the film, it would just be like this entire, I don't know, the film would just come alive in the most miraculous way, and he couldn't sing the praises of your work enough. I'm kind of curious what that whole process was like for you, obviously because you haven't worked in animation before, and this is the first animated film you scored. So I guess how did your the scoring process work alongside the editing process, and was it really any different from what you'd previously done in live action?
Yeah, I mean, it was really different. So I was on the project for almost 2 years, and because of that, when I came on, they were still editing with the black and white pencil sketch storyboards, essentially. And as I would write over that 2 years, they would, send it to previs and then to early animation and so on and so forth. But what was really fascinating is that they were so good at getting the story dialed in that storyboard phase, especially because they can't really edit very much once it goes into animation.
Mm-hmm.
I was able to write to picture from the very beginning, and so
Wow.
like some of the cues that I was writing at the very beginning are still pretty much the same version of the cue that's in the final film. Just I continued to make iterations and adjustments to it as I saw the visuals change, and of course, if Kris had any notes and things like that. But for the most part, a lot of those cues that I wrote to the black and white pencil sketches are still the same in the final version, and I think that's probably the biggest difference because in live action, they are, at least in my experience, typically editing to the very last minute,
Yeah.
trying to continue to tweak the film, and also some of those edits can be pretty drastic. It might be, moving a scene to a different part of the movie. It could be removing a scene completely. There are times where, I've written a cue to picture, and then a month later, the editor and director tell me, "Oh, you know what? That sequence we actually shaved off about 45 seconds."
Yeah.
And musically, that's a huge difference. Even like 5 seconds is a pretty big difference musically.
Yeah.
And so, not needing to worry about making adjustments to the music allowed me to write things that could be as detailed and specific to picture as possible, which I haven't had the opportunity to do very often.
Yeah, well, I mean, you mentioned that, and I've seen videos of you and Kris sort of talking about the fact that he basically kind of gave you just the freedom to write specifically for that migration sequence, where he was like, "Hey, don't worry about timing this out. It's like you just write the music, and we'll cut the picture around your music." And I have to imagine that's like kind of unheard of for a composer, unless you're ideating from the very beginning and they're going to take that music and work it however they want in the film. But to be afforded like the latitude to really be the star of that sequence, I mean, obviously it's you with the music, or sorry, it's you with the visuals, but I mean, was that freeing? Was there like a bit of pressure there? Like, how did that feel?
I mean, it felt so I felt so trusted, which I think is a really amazing feeling as a collaborator,
Yeah.
because like you said, it's something that doesn't happen really ever, especially with animation these days, because it's not the same as cutting live action where you don't have to have as much, or it's a little easier to make things like spot on in terms of like just making a cut instead of like having to figure out all the components of animation, making sure that they don't affect the music. And for me, luckily, Kris gave me that directive after I landed the theme, because my first pass at that sequence wasn't right emotionally and tonally.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until I, made my third try essentially, that he gave me that directive to just try to go off and write the music and focus on that and see how it wants to develop, and they would build around the music. So I felt like I had the confidence because through trial and error, we arrived at something that we both felt like was hitting the nail on the head. And so then having that uh charge from Kris really just kind of and reinforced any sort of confidence I had in writing that piece of music, because it was like, okay, I think this is right. No, that's not right. I think this is right. No, that's not right. I think this is right. Yes, that's it. Keep going.
Yeah.
And so to have that kind of encouragement, I think just felt like you know, uh, kind of turbocharged the process for me.
Sure. I mean, it almost sounds like he was directing you like he would one of his actors.
Yeah, exactly. I think that that's something that's so amazing about Kris is his ability to interact with me as a composer in that way. And with actors, I often hear Kris talking about not wanting to give line readings, like which basically means
Yeah.
to not, like say something in the way you want the actor to say it. And I think that it's very similar with music. He was very good at having a conversation with me about how each moment is meant to feel, but not trying to tell me what he thought I should be doing to achieve that.
Yeah, yeah. I guess what were some of the ways that he kind of pulled what would eventually become that main theme out of you? Like, what were some of like the because like you said, he doesn't want to give explicit direction, but like, what were some of maybe those emotions and feelings that he would kind of point you in, where he would bring up, and you kind of tuned into what he was getting at?
Yeah, I mean, that sequence in particular and that theme in particular was really us talking about parenthood. Because my daughter, when I was working on that sequence, was, maybe 7 months old or so. And his first note to me was to imagine dropping her off at college, and saying goodbye to her. And ironically, the first version I wrote, that's what I was envisioning. And when I told him that, we talked more about what's really happening for Brightbill and Roz in this moment. And the fact that they're not saying goodbye, they're not saying I love you, they may never see each other again. Um, and there's something that's happened between them that um, has forever impacted their relationship and might be something that they can't come back from. And the thought about that possibility um, in my parenthood journey was something I didn't want to imagine with a 7 month old. Like at that point, it was very easy for me to live in this fantasy of us having this perfect relationship. And having that conversation reminded me that even if we have a positive relationship by the time I drop her off at college, there's going to be so many things that have happened between now and then that are going to uh, just put us through challenging moments. That
Yeah,
there are going to be times where I'm doing my best as a parent, and that's something that's upset her or that falls short of what she feels she needs, um, or something that an aspect of who I am that she's going to have to learn to accept about me. Like all of those things, I think, are things that I was too early in my parenthood journey to really consider and to really want to consider the idea of us being in a place where we're not on speaking terms, especially at a moment that's as scary and emotional as saying goodbye to your child and having them go off and live their own life.
yeah,
And so it really encouraged me to, and Kris is a father as well. And Mary Blee, the picture editor, was in that conversation. She
yeah,
has kids. I think that it was all of us talking about them almost, reminding me of the depth of parenthood as like, seasoned parents and me being just at the beginning of that journey.
yeah,
I think it's that, was not only helpful for me with writing that theme, but also just helpful for me as a parent.
yeah, yeah.
It was those emotions that I thought of and reflected on that led me to the piece that it ended up being.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that, I mean, it all comes true, or it all comes through, because I think, I mean, something that's just so beautiful about this film, and something I've talked with, a bunch of friends of mine who we saw the film with, it really kind of puts into perspective the fact it's a movie about parenthood that is clearly made by parents,
Mm.
and it kind of puts to the forefront this idea that, like, we don't really think of it when we're kids, but our parents are living life for the first time, just like at a different stage. And so like all of these things, like parenthood is like this big giant improvisation. Like you have no idea what you're doing. You're kind of figuring it out as you go along. And I think just kids don't necessarily like realize that. And there is like a melancholy in that. And I think you really kind of tap into that with your music.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah, I love the way you said that too.
As you know, that migration sequence is going on, and obviously Brightbill is going through the trials beforehand, and then that obviously culminates in that beautiful sequence. Was there ever I don't know if there's been like a moment throughout your career where you felt maybe like Brightbill in that moment where you felt like you were able to kind of finally fly on your own after just like a bunch of trials or whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's there's always all these stages, right? Like I think about when I first um graduated from school and was touring and was able to financially support myself. And like, as an artist, that's like such an amazing thing, especially a young artist, and that dynamic between parents wanting you to be able to sustain yourself and not be on their, dime anymore,
Yeah,
essentially.
yeah, yeah,
And the moment where you're actually able to do that. And, it's such a gamble being an artist, and to, remember at the time I was like 22 or so when I first started touring at a level where I was able to afford my own life. I think that was something that felt pretty wild. But also I think a similar transition for me happened when I started to get into film scoring at a level where I again could sustain myself on that, because I
mm,
really had a bridge where I scored my first, I don't know, 4 or 5 documentaries that I worked on mostly on tour. Like it was me
mm,
doing a show and going back to the hotel and working on a queue and getting up and going to the airport. And
wow.
so I was trying to do both, and it was at a point where I had enough work to stop touring for a while and just focus on film composing, and for that to flourish in a way where I wasn't, um, you know, struggling or figuring out how to go back to touring to financially support myself. I feel like that was another moment where it felt like that. And I'd say third, honestly, this movie in a lot of ways, just because um, I grew up loving animation. Up until high school, I thought I was going to be an animator, actually, more than a musician.
Yeah,
Uh,
I want to ask you a little bit about that later, but no, please continue. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah,
but I just loved that art form,
yeah,
um, and especially as a musician, I loved music's responsibility in those projects when it's done at its highest level. And
yeah.
so this film and the way that Kris used music and encouraged me to write felt like, me being unashamedly myself musically, in a lot of ways that felt like creatively flying, and I think that was
Hmm.
really an amazing aspect of the collaboration with Kris.
Yeah, I guess kind of going back that moment where you moved from being a, or I guess the moment where you first started going out and touring and playing your music, um, would was that I guess the moment where you kind of felt like you made it, I guess, in a sense, or was there a different moment where maybe you realize, oh wait, oh this is actually something that like I'm kind of living the dream that I always envisioned for myself.
Yeah, I guess more so the latter. I
Yeah,
never, but even now, I still would never say that I've made it. I think I still have like deep fears that somehow it's
sure,
all gonna
yeah,
stop. But I think that eh, there are definitely a lot of moments I remember being on tour, in my early 20s and going to crazy places around the world and all of that stuff, where I felt a lot of moments of feeling very grateful that I'm being paid to have that experience and to do what I love on that level. And yeah, I definitely had a lot of thoughts like that.
yeah. I'm curious just because I know a lot of composers I guess have really started to dabble in live performance and stuff like that, and obviously touring around the world and playing their works. I guess the first question is, one, is that something you'd ever be interested in doing, given the fact that you originally came from that kind of background? And then also, did the theatricality, I guess, of live performance cause you to think a bit more cinematically about your own work?
As far as like do I want to go back to playing live? 100%. I mean, what's interesting about these periods where we're celebrating the release of something and we have events to go to and interviews and all that stuff. Every now and then, those things are accompanied with a performance from me.
Yeah.
And the reason why I love doing that is because a big part of my compositional process is improvising to arrive at a theme. It's like me with that main theme, it was literally me looking at my daughter and like thinking about how she made me feel and thinking about, you know, breaking her heart or like any of those very, very difficult things that
Mhm.
viscerally bring up an emotion in me when I think about it. And then just going to the piano and improvising and trying to like play to re-trigger those emotions. And because what ends up in the movie is like a 3-minute piece of music that I arrived at from, sometimes hours of improvisation. I often love playing those pieces of music and improvising on them to kind of demonstrate or have an opportunity to continue the process of improvising on this idea,
Yeah.
right? Because
Yeah.
like that's the reason why I connected with music in the first place was like, oh, I have this feeling, I can't really express it verbally, or I don't have a place to express it verbally. I can improvise on it for an hour, and I feel like I've said much more than I could in any sort of conversation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I love that aspect of it. And then, as far as the theatrical aspect of performing, I think that for me, the performance, it was really more about like two things. One, the communication that's happening with my fellow musicians. Like to me, that was the most beautiful aspect of playing live is like, especially in the improvisatory jazz context, is like, oh, the saxophone player or the guitar player played something that makes me think of this idea. So I'm going to play this. And then that I can hear that the drummer heard that and is playing something else. And then the bass player plays something. And now the sax player is like playing off of that. So it's like this real time conversation that at its highest form is like, to me, the best example of listening and the best example of dialogue that surpasses at times even dialogue verbally, because
Yeah.
requires such a deep level of listening to have that. So it was my own expression that I really connected to, and the fact that we are giving those emotions or providing those emotions or accentuating emotions that the audience has. So like, I only had a handful of times where I performed at a level where there was a theatrical aspect to it. I feel like sometimes that it was hard to maintain that intimacy of conversation and dialogue in those big theatrical things. So I feel like, my desire to perform in any sort of way that has a cinematic quality has much more of a connection to like, the character driven, the emotional driven aspects of story,
Yeah.
and uh and the intimate aspect of what music can do that does translate on a big stage, but not necessarily like the lights, camera,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, and I guess speaking about that that communal experience that that jazz provides, I mean that kind of feels like the improvisation of that and being surrounded by people who are also trying to help you out and give you your moment. I mean that also feels very in line with what the movie is about, with what The Wild Robot is about. And so I'm kind of curious if maybe the film spoke to you on that level where you're the constant listening, conversing, navigating the spontaneity of what's going on. I mean, was that something that maybe was on your mind when you were considering the project or something?
Yeah, definitely. I think that the idea of interacting with people that are different from you and taking the time to actually get to know and understand them is an idea that exists in the story and exists in the film, and I feel it's such an important thing for us to remember,
Yeah,
especially in times like now. Like I think that
yeah,
I've always, it's funny. My wife and I talk about the fact that it drives me a little crazy sometimes, but I on Instagram, for example, follow a lot of people that I disagree with, but it's in large part to not remain in an echo chamber of things that I feel are right, and
Right,
how
right.
much the way we live is a subjective experience no matter what, and there's literally nothing that's objective about right or wrong. That I feel like it's important to have an openness and a comfortability with like interacting with something that isn't the same as how you see the world. And so that's definitely something in this film that I feel like is a message that I really connected with, and feel like it's something that I hoped and do think it will impact people when they watch it.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I guess how did you seek to kind of capture that uh uh, I guess for lack of a better word, the dichotomy between those ideas, I guess the rigid kind of, harsh reality of the world the characters live in, and then also this kind of, I don't know, this really intimate motherly kind of relationship going on. That, I guess, it's the harsh exterior with like the heart of the film, I guess, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. Something that I was really intentional with this score is the score has a lot of moments of um structured chaos and
Mm,
entropy. Like, I thought about how um the sandbox percussion stuff I think is a big part of that,
mm,
because the way it's written out and composed, even though they're playing for the most part parts that were written for them, um, they're written in a way that's supposed to feel very improvisatory and very like frenetic and chaotic. Um, and there are other elements that also are meant to mirror that feeling. But then at the core, in terms of the maternal and warmth that the story has, I think that's where making sure that there is strong melody was a big component, because for me, that's the thing that on a universal level makes us feel like indelibly connected to a piece of music. Like there are definitely pieces of music that we like to listen to and that make us feel a certain way, but like when we, you know, are feeling a certain feeling, we often go to a piece of music that we can sing along to, or we think about like, singing to, a baby, or like these things, like we sing melodies. Like we don't just sing, like background parts essentially. And I
yeah,
think
yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
because of that, I think there's something about melody that makes us feel like a different level of connection to music. And that idea of these themes being something that, no matter how much the music might be chaotic or have moments of like compositional or orchestrational production wise, like warmth and feeling to it,
Yeah.
like the melody is actually what really drives home that feeling of connection and humanity, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I know you're obviously the John Williams does that better than obviously like anyone on the planet for sure. I mean, it'll stick with you. But I'm curious, for you, what do you think is the secret to making that really, that catchy melody that I guess it hits you in the feels, and that it causes you to it causes the piece of music to stick with you.
Yeah, I think for me it's the way that I at least test it for myself is whenever I write a melody, I will leave the piano and sing it to myself over the course of days.
Hmm.
Um, and the reason why it's like days is because I want to get as far away from the muscle memory of that melody as possible, because there are so many times with this film, with every project I work on, where I write a melody on piano, and then like a day and a half, I'm, you know, on a walk with my family or at the grocery store, and I'll try to hum it to myself, and I will naturally change it based on what feels natural for me to sing.
Hmm.
And there are so many things that I do habitually that are on the piano that are based on like muscle memory and like shapes that feel right to me, that no matter how hard I try to sing what I played, it doesn't feel right singing it.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
also think that's like, I think that my favorite songwriters in like more pop sense are the people that write these melodies that the average person can sing that can't sing, that they can sing it. And I think there's something really interesting when you find those melodies that have the right amount of complexity to them, that they feel like something that's new and interesting, but at the same time, it's something that the average person can sing. So usually I feel like that's whenever I land on something that I sing and it's easy for me to recall, that like a few days later I can recall it. Or also another thing I do is also ask my wife, if she remembers a theme that I wrote. And because she's not a musician, if like 2 days later she can actually sing the melody, and to me it's like, okay, then there's something there in
Yeah.
terms of this.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. Just out of curiosity, real quick, what are the who do you think are the pop artists, or I guess just the mainstream artists that seem to have a real a knack for that?
I mean, the person that was in my mind when I was saying that is
Yeah.
is actually Stevie Wonder.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
what's so fascinating about him is the fact that the harmonies that he's writing are pretty complex, but somehow he writes these very simple melodies on top of very complex harmonies. I think that's what makes him feel um, just a different type of artist. I also think that in terms of more contemporary artists, two that come to mind are actually Olivia Rodrigo and Billie Eilish. I think that like both of them also have an incredible ability to write melodies that are pretty simple, but also you could play it on piano and it's clear that that's the melody. Like, I think that's also the test of a great melody, is that if you can just play it on piano or on guitar and strip down and it's very clear what that is,
Yeah.
then it's clear that that's a strong song. And I think the two of them in terms of like really, really modern artists are really great at doing that.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely agree with the Billy and yeah, Billy and Phineas. I mean, they're geniuses. It just they
Yeah, for sure.
continue to blow my mind. I kind of want to go back to the what you mentioned earlier about you originally wanting to be a cartoonist when you were in high school and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I guess where did that aspiration sort of come from? And is there any part of that initial passion that maybe informs your work as a musician or composer?
It's an interesting question. Yeah, so I feel like where it came from is when I was a kid, I just doodle a lot, and like I was already, and my parents still have my like art notebook and like portfolio thing from when I was in like third or fourth grade. And then when I was in middle school, they actually put me in a cartooning school that I went to every weekend, and
Oh wow.
my teacher was actually Butch Hartman, who created the
Oh
Fairly Odd.
wow. That's pretty cool. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah, it was amazing. I remember the day where he told us that he had a meeting to pitch the Fairly Odd Parents, and then he was like, "Yeah, they're actually going to turn into this show." And now, he's one of the greatest
Yeah, yeah.
of our generation. But yeah, I think that I remember in that class in particular, the thing that was amazing with him is that he talked a lot about creating a world. It's like creating characters, and so I remember looking back, through my portfolio of that time. It's like I had characters that are going through these situations, and like a cast that was expressing different parts of myself essentially. And like I think that that's the thing that started to, it felt very similar to my interest in music, is like
Mhm.
this is a way for me to, like, I feel very clear that there are different aspects of my own personality that can be expressed in different characters, whether it's a character that is very nerdy or a character that's cool. It's like I'm not entirely either of those things, but I'm very much. I have moments of feeling more nerdy than cool, but definitely a few moments of like feeling some of those things in a way, and also being able to live out fantasies of like there might be a part of me that has anger, but I don't express that very often. But I can make a character that's angry, and like that's great to be able to like put that energy into something. Um, in terms of like where it exists now, definitely a bit more of what I was just saying, that like there's a clarity in um understanding that like a cast of characters can be an expression of different parts of ourselves. And I think that that's the reason why I love writing music for film, is that each theme that I'm writing, each like character I'm writing for, I can tap into what part of myself connects to that character, even if it's a character I wouldn't ever want to be, or I feel like I'm very far from. Like, that's the thing about great storytelling, is that, like, not everything's black and white, and we all could be, somebody. And so being able to tap into that, I think, is a big part of my interest in storytelling that comes from the animation space. And the other thing I would say is, actually, the reason why I never actually pursued cartooning is because when I went to high school, I went to an arts high school, and they required your portfolio to be um wholly original, and to be all original work.
Mm,
And
okay.
most of my drawings at that time, I'd say, were like 80 to 90% me copying things. And my goal was, my freshman year of high school, I was going to build up my art portfolio with original work, and then switch to visual arts for my sophomore year. And my freshman year, I just fell so deeply in love with music and jazz and improvisation that I just decided at the end of that year, I'm going to stick with music.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I want to ask you a little bit about the use of music in animation, because I think, specific, like, for animated films, because so many of them are geared towards younger viewers. I feel like there's an insistence on spelling out exactly what the characters are saying in the overall film, because they don't trust the audience to really get it, so they want to make sure that they get it. But I think with The Wild Robot, and this is true of like the writing and everything, but specifically with the music, you really take a mature approach, treating the audience with respect, and allowing the music to emotionally convey the things that perhaps, in a lesser version of the film would have been explicitly spelled out. So I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about the importance of trusting the audience, and allowing the foundational languages, or sorry, the foundational language of cinema, like sight and sound, to take a front seat, where perhaps traditionally it wouldn't have.
Yeah, I think I have to give a lot of credit to Chris in that crafting of the story, and thinking that just visual language and musical language could convey those things, because he said from the very beginning he wanted to have music be this character that is helping carry the narrative. And he was incredible at um, noticing moments where that was happening, and deciding to remove dialogue. Like, there were a lot of meetings where we had um, a cue that I played for him, and he would listen to it and then tell Mary, I don't think we need these lines here. Like, I think that, like, now, with, like, what's being said visually and what's being said musically, like, I think it's actually pretty clear what the feeling is. And just continue to do that. I think that's also the mark of a great storyteller and director, is trusting that people are going to get the idea just with, like, what they're seeing and what they're feeling and hearing.
Yeah.
And in terms of not handling it with kid gloves, essentially, I think a lot of that goes back to that first main theme that I wrote, and our conversations around that, and deciding to handle it in this way that was a bit more grounded and complex and bittersweet. Um, and and I think our connection to the history of animation, because when you look at they often talk about Bambi on the visual side, in terms of, like, how much it inspired them, but also, like, narratively, when you look at stories like that, it's dealing with, like, very heavy issues. And also, when you look at that era of music for film, it's, like, just as good as a lot of intense classical pieces of music. And I think that, like, they weren't writing children music, they were writing, like, very serious classical music,
Yeah.
essentially, for a
Yeah.
lot of cartoons. And so I think that was something also in my mind, that, this isn't music that's supposed to feel like kids' music. It's music that's supposed to feel like as grounded and serious and considered as the story is.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Outside of Bambi, I'm kind of curious, what are animated films that you think do that really well?
I think the Miyazaki films, of
Yeah,
course,
well,
I
yeah,
think
yeah,
do that
yeah,
incredibly well. There's also uh Lion King, in terms of story, and even, like, what Hans did musically. But, like, I remember seeing that when I was a kid, and being so emotionally blown away by the idea of this young, you know, child essentially losing their father, and in such a violent way, and also at the hands of another family member. And like those are very complex ideas for a kid to be exposed to. And it's through the lens of animals, but it's very heavy stuff. So I feel like those are two that stand out to me in terms of uh, artists or filmmakers that were able to do that.
Yeah, for sure. And I definitely think The Wild Robot, both as a film and also musically, is continuing that lineage, of exactly what you were just talking about. So, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, so I'll cut you loose on this question right here. I think what's interesting about you is you've obviously you've worked on your own films from behind the camera as a director, whether it's on something like Concerto or Last Repair Shop. And I'm kind of curious what gave you the push to want to make your own films, and if you still have that filmmaking bug and could see yourself directing a feature film, whether it is animated, maybe going back to those visual artist roots, or otherwise.
Yeah, in terms of what gave me the bug, a lot of it was my co-director on those films, Ben Proudfoot. Because with our first film together, Concerto's a Conversation, he was going to direct a film about me writing a concerto, and I just happened to tell him my grandfather's story, and he encouraged me to not only have my grandfather have that conversation on camera, but because um, it was in large part me directing the conversation, he involved me in that directorial role primarily for that reason. And then that led to the Last Repair Shop, which was me being a bit more involved on the directorial side of things, but also again, just him leading the way, and me learning more about that side of storytelling.
Yeah.
But it's something that, I mean, we actually met because I wrote a short film that kind of became a self-funded student film that Ben produced for me essentially.
Oh,
And
okay.
that also, my interest in doing that actually came from working with Kobe Bryant,
Oh,
because I
wow.
worked with him on his documentary for Showtime, but
Yeah.
I worked with him all the way until he passed, and he was getting into filmmaking and storytelling. And so he was a very familial minded leader when it came to his production studio, in that there was a house that we worked out of, and like, even though I was writing the music, I went down there for meetings about the cut of the film and all that kind of stuff. And so watching him get to learn storytelling, and like him talking about his fascination with Joseph Campbell, and like that's where I started reading Joseph Campbell's because of Kobe, and like getting to Carl Jung and like all this stuff. And so the idea of storytelling being something else I can get into in this filmmaking way actually started there. And that's why I wrote the short film, and that's how I met Ben, and that's what led to the two documentaries. And so it's definitely something I'm still interested in. Like Ben and I are working on another project together, and trying to work on a feature film, and
Yeah.
I have some like short films that I want to make. So it's definitely something I want to continue to do, but it's always going to be very music led and sound led, because I feel like that's still the clearest way for me to articulate myself is through music.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, I'll be looking forward to seeing those projects. I mean, it sounds like you have a nice little, like, yeah, you've got two cool little passions that you're able to pursue simultaneously.
Right.
So yeah, no, that's awesome. Listen, Kris, I thank you so much for your time here. I know we've been chatting for a while, but I really appreciate you taking the time chatting about this incredible score. Your work is, I mean, it's up there as like one of my favorite scores of the year. It is truly just this transcendent piece of music that I mean, I don't know. It's a big part, I think, of why that film works. It's crucial to the heart of the movie.
Thanks so much, Griffin. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course, man.